If you stroll through Embankment Gardens today, you might notice a strange ruin standing alone in the flower beds. Ornate, weathered, but it leads nowhere. It's standing 150 yards away from the water it was built to serve. Look at the stairs. 200 years ago, I'd have been waist high in the Thames at high tide. It wasn't a garden then, it was a private jetty.
Behind wasn't a row of offices, but York House, a riverside palace of Italian marble and stolen art. This single gate is the last breath of a riverside world that is barely imaginable today. Before the Victorians moved the shoreline, the Strand was exactly what the name implies, derived from the Old English word strand, meaning edge of the water. In those days, the Thames was the city's main highway, the fastest, safest way to move through London. This stretch of the shore was the city's original Millionaires' Row, a solid wall of power. Today, the Strand is lined with theatres, hotels and traffic, but a few hundred years ago, it played host to some of the most exclusive real estate in England. This is where Henry VIII's wives sought refuge, where Sir Walter Raleigh argued the stars with forbidden scientists, where traitors whispered in vaulted cellars before launching rebellions that shook the throne. In this episode, we're going to go find the urban fossils they left behind, from the stones of the rebel stairs to the hidden grates that still show a Tudor world sitting under our feet. This is the story of the lost palaces of London's Embankment. To understand why this ground was so coveted, you'd have to forget the roads. In the 13th century, the Thames wasn't a view, it was a city's bloodstream. If you wanted status, you needed a front door to the river. The stretch between Westminster and the city became the most expensive strip of land in England. These weren't just houses, they were statements of power, designed to be seen from the water. Imagine a skyline of turrets, private chapels, terraces over the river, with gardens spilling down into private jetties, boathouses on wooden pilings, rising and falling with the tide. With access to the highway of the Thames, it was some of London's most sought-after land. By Henry VIII's reign, this corridor was packed with courtiers and royal favourites. One of the brightest jewels was Arundel House, first held by the bishops of Bath and Wells, later by the Howard family. Inside, the Arundel marbles, a huge collection of classical sculpture, is incredibly something that we can see today at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. Just along the river, Durham House took on a second life when Elizabeth I granted it to Sir Walter Raleigh. Under his roof, poets, scientists and courtiers gathered in what later writers would call the School of Night, debating astronomy, faith and dangerous new ideas by candlelight. Add in Somerset House, and we're starting to form a wall of power along the waterline. Somerset, commissioned through Jane Seymour's powerful family, was praised as one of England's first true Renaissance palaces. Even though Edward Seymour was executed before it was finished, it outshone anything else on the river. Later, it became the London base of Princess Elizabeth, watching gilded barges slide past while she waited to see if she'd survive her sister Mary's reign. Things have changed a lot around here since then, but the footprints are still there if you know when to look. At low tide, a ghostly line of ancient wooden pilings appears on the foreshore, the last physical remains of those private boathouses that launched the boats all those years ago. And the echoes aren't just in the mud, they're under your feet. Down at the end of Essex Street, which still follows the rough outline of Robert Devereux's palace, modern officers sit on top of stone vaults, cellars that shook with the noise of his failed 1601 rebellion. Further along, George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, turned York House into a palace of Italian marble and priceless art. The Watergate wasn't just a gate, it was the front door to his ego, a statement piece you could only really appreciate from the river. But Villiers didn't just leave us a gate, he left us his signature. When the Duke's heirs eventually sold the estate to developers, they were forced by contract to name the new streets after him. If you look at the street signs around the Watergate, you'll see George Street, Villiers Street, Duke Street, and Buckingham Street.
To complete the title, he even named one of the alleys of Alley, now known as York Place. It's one of the only streets in London named after a preposition.
Between these surviving giants sat the most cursed patch of ground on the Strand, the Savoy Palace. In the 14th century, this was the palace of all palaces, the home of the maligned John of Gaunt. It was so opulent it sparked a revolution. In 1381, during the Peasants Revolt, a mob didn't just loot this place, they sought to erase it. They threw the Duke's gold into the Thames and chopped his legendary silk beds to pieces. But the destruction turned from a riot into an explosion when the mob stumbled upon stores of volatile powders. In a moment of blissful ignorance, rioters hurled them into the Great Hall's massive fireplace, with devastating consequences. The resulting explosion was so powerful, it didn't just burn the palace, it blew large parts of the building apart, bringing the stone roof crashing down and sealing the vaults below. Legend has it that 32 looters, who had sneaked into the cellars to drink the Duke's wine, were entombed by the collapse. For 7 days, passers-by on the Strand reportedly heard their muffled cries coming from beneath the rubble until the voices finally fell silent. Today, the palace is gone, but the Queen's Chapel of the Savoy still stands in its shadow. If you look at its medieval masonry, you're looking at the only witness to that night of fire and destruction. While the palace was erased, this chapel remained, a lone survivor of the original Strand, tucked away in a hollow that the 21st century hasn't quite managed to fill.
To really see the scars of the old Strand, you have to leave the gardens and come here, to Essex Street. In 1601, this played host to one of English history's most desperate moments.
This street sits on the footprint of Essex House, the Riverside palace of Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. Once the Queen's most intimate favourite, he was a man of blazing ambition who couldn't handle his own decline. Ruined by debt and loss of royal favour, he turned his home into a desperate fortress, pulling 200 armed followers inside these walls to plot his doomed coup against Elizabeth I. The rebellion collapsed almost instantly. He marched out of these gates towards the city, found no support, and was driven back here as the Queen's soldiers closed in. Trapped between the army and the river, he surrendered at the foot of his own stairs. Because the tide was too low to shoot the rapids of the London Bridge, he was held here in his own home for one final, humiliating night, before being rowed away from this jetty to face the axe at the Tower. Today, Essex Street still follows that old palace line. Under the glass and steel, vaulted stone cellars survive. If you walk all the way down to where Essex Street meets Milford Lane, take a second to look at how narrow and steep this passage is. This was a holloway, a boundary ditch between the great estates. This was a no man's land for the servants, tradesmen, and horses that kept the palaces running.
In the 18th century, this wasn't a grand entranceway. This is where the stairs met the mud of the Thames, where the Earl's men would have boarded their boats all those years ago. And look at these stones. They're weathered and pockmarked like the brick isn't. I've got a hunch that these are original stones from one of the dismantled palaces.
If there's one place that perfectly embodies the transformation of the Strand, it's Somerset House. Most people come here for the ice rink in winter or the grand galleries, but for the urban investigator, the real story is beneath your boots. While the grand Somerset House you see today was designed by Sir William Chambers in the 1770s, it sits directly on the stones of a much older world. The original Tudor palace here was one of the most important palaces on the Strand, home to the future Queen Elizabeth I during the dangerous reign of her sister Mary. From these windows, she watched the river glitter with gilded barges, knowing that every boat could carry an arrest warrant. When Chambers rebuilt the site, he didn't entirely clear the ruins. He used them as a foundation, raising the new courtyard on a massive system of brick vaults. Let's head down towards the embankment entrance.
Stop here for a while and look through these iron grates. Here, you're literally looking through the lid of the modern city.
Peer through those bars, and you aren't looking into a standard basement. You're looking down at the Tudor ground level from the original palace. Down there, visible in the shadows, are the brick foundations and light wells of the Chambers building, which reused the footprint and some of the stone from the Tudor palace. In fact, at the right moment during repairs, you can catch a glimpse of the 18th century veneer peeled back. Beneath the modern slabs, we can see the older worn paving stones of a previous century. Under a glass floor, sadly not open to the public, you're looking straight at Tudor foundations. Real stone from Somerset's palace, sitting beneath today's offices and lecture theatres. In nearby vault walls are Tudor-era burials, later absorbed into the structure. But the palace plumbing went even further. Just a few yards away, tucked down a narrow alley on Strand Lane, is one of London's most famous tall tales, the so-called Roman bath. For years, people believed this was a relic of the Roman city of Londinium, but the truth is even more remarkable for our story. It's actually a 17th century cistern, later adapted for use as a plunge bath. Built around 1612, it was designed to feed the elaborate fountains and grottos of the old Somerset House gardens. It's a rare surviving example of high-end Stuart engineering, a fossil of the luxury that once defined this riverbank before it was all roofed over and forgotten. And the investigation doesn't end with the palace walls. Just a few years ago, archaeologists working in the basements here uncovered a massive medieval cesspit, a 14-foot deep tower of filth that served the residents of the Strand for centuries. The embankment we know today wasn't the first attempt to tame this shoreline. Almost a century earlier, an experiment rose here that was so ambitious it nearly bankrupted its owners. The Adelphi. In the 1770s, the Adam brothers didn't just want to build houses, they wanted to lift the city off the river entirely. They drove a labyrinth of brick arches into the muddy banks of the Thames, creating the Adelphi vaults. To understand the scale of this, head down to the hidden Lower Robert Street. It's one of the strangest roads in London. A sunken Georgian service street threaded through the Adelphi's vaulted understructure. When you walk here, you're not beneath the 18th century structure, you're inside it. Notice the arches. In the 1700s, this wasn't just dead space. These vaults hosted warehouses, stables, and stores that opened towards the river wharves. Horses, carts, barrels, coal. The machinery of London's wealth moved through this damp, echoing underworld, while the fashionable society lived in the sunlight above. The door of one of these surviving townhouses, black, glossy, with a brass knocker, looks strikingly familiar. It shares the same Georgian design language as the door of number 10 Downing Street. But the history of the Strand isn't just the grand arches and the stone foundations. It's etched into the very pavement you're walking on. If you look down, you'll see them everywhere. Small circular iron plates known as coal holes. Long before the embankment was built, coal was delivered by barge to the wharves we've been looking for. From there, it was carted up these sloping streets and tipped through these holes into the dark cellars of the mansions and hotels above. These covers aren't just functional. Intricate patterns of stars, diamonds, and grids prevented Victorian pedestrians from sliding in the rain. By the mid-19th century, the Millionaires' row of the Strand had reached the breaking point. The river that had once been a shimmering highway for royal barges had transformed into a toxic, sluggish, open sewer. For decades, as London's population exploded, the city's waste was dumped directly into the Thames. The result was a ticking time bomb of cholera outbreaks and filth that finally exploded in the summer of 1858. This was the Great Stink. A heat wave struck the city, causing the exposed tidal mudflats, the very same beach the palaces were built upon, to ferment. The stench was so aggressive that Parliament had to soak their curtains in chloride of lime. The city was no longer just unsightly, it was literally choking on its own filth. This crisis gave the legendary engineer, Joseph Bazalgette, the ultimate mandate. His solution was one of the greatest engineering feats of the Victorian age. But it also completely transformed the original Riverside as the contemporaries would have known it. Between 1864 and 1870, Bazalgette didn't just clean the river, he performed a massive act of land grab. He built the Victoria Embankment, a colossal granite shield that reclaimed 37 acres of land from the Thames. This wasn't just a wall, it was a complex hydraulic machine. Inside that embankment, he buried the massive intercepting sewers that still serve London today, along with a new subway for the District Line and tunnels for gas and water pipes. But to do this, he had to entomb the original shoreline. The private jetties, the wooden boathouses, and the stone river stairs of the Strand palaces were buried under millions of tons of landfill and brick rubble. The river was pushed back hundreds of feet south, trapped behind a wall of grey granite. If you want to see the literal breadth of this Victorian machine, look at the iconic, ornate lamp standards that line the embankment. At first glance, they look like standard civic ornaments, but look closer at the base, and the air vents from the sewers below sharpen into view. In some cases, these gases fueled the sewer gas destructor lamps.
They might look like ordinary lamp standards, but they're actually part of a machine. They vent foul air up from the sewers beneath your feet. This is the physical evidence of the sacrifice. The aristocratic waterfront was paved over and replaced by something that could keep London alive.
When you stand by the York Watergate now, it isn't just stranded in a park, it's sitting on top of a tomb. Beneath the grass and the gravel paths lies the original tidal mud of the 1600s, preserved under the weight of the Victorian engineering that saved London, but changed the world of the Strand palaces beyond recognition. To truly feel the weight of this lost world, you have to go back underground. Just a stone's throw from the Watergate sits Gordon's Wine Bar. Established in 1890, it's famously claimed to be the oldest wine cellar in London, but its architectural DNA goes back much further. When you sit in these candlelit vaults, you are sitting within the literal foundations of the York House estate. In the 1680s, the great diarist Samuel Pepys lived in the house directly above these vaults. A century later, Rudyard Kipling lived above, writing The Light That Failed, while the floorboards trembled from the construction of the District Line just feet below. There's a slope to the floor in Gordon's. It tilts towards the river. You're sitting on the hard, the sloping transition where the palace met the mud. It's one of the few places where the Millionaires Row doesn't feel like a dusty map, but like a living, breathing space. But the Strand's transformation remained incomplete until the last of its great houses fell. Northumberland House at the western end. It was a massive Jacobean fortress with a famous lead lion, the Percy lion, standing on its roof, with its tail straight as a poker. In 1874, the house was demolished, not because it was a ruin, but because it stood in the way of the grand design. The city needed a direct road to connect Charing Cross to the new embankment. They tore down Northumberland House to make way for Northumberland Avenue. The Percy lion was moved to Syon House, and with him, the last guard of the old Riverside was gone.
So we return, full circle, to the York Watergate. Built as a statement of power, it's now stranded in a city that's moved the world away hundreds of yards. But these are the fossils, the urban clues, of a city that's constantly reinventing itself. Thank you for joining me on this investigation, and I'll see you again next time.